In the spring of 2021, Garth Ruff, Ohio State University Extension beef field specialist, and Jerad Jaborek, Feedlot Systems Extension Educator at Michigan State University, hosted a three-part webinar series on management considerations for beef-sired calves from dairy cows. This third session on May 5th focused on a compilation of management considerations involved in successfully utilizing beef sires on dairy cows. In this second half of the third webinar presentation, Garth Ruff detailed management and marketing considerations that lead to greater calf values, including the benefits of vaccinations, timely dehorning and castration, valuing the cost of gain versus total calf value, utilizing added value marketing programs, the benefits to the marketplace in selling calves in groups, and considerations for using implants.
I certainly appreciate Jerad talking about some of the nutrition and genetics. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on some management considerations and kind of being intentional. One of our previous presenters talked about being intentional as we make these decisions as it relates to dairy beef calves. So we're going to keep that in mind as we kind of wrap things up here for our program. You know, when we think about producing those less than a week old or even deacon calves, as we talked about value, a lot of those calves are sold private treaty, and it's tough to get those values, but we can look at the baby calf markets to get a rough idea. A couple examples here. We got the Ohio market where we see those crossbred calves bring anywhere from $30 on the low end to $90 on the high end over the top Holstein bull calves. And then maybe a little bit more detail out of Pennsylvania on a market report. Seems to be a pretty strong baby calf market. We can look there. The calves are similar weight, those beef cross calves, plus or minus $170 over their Holstein counterparts. But I think as we go through this, we need to consider the pros and cons of marketing those week-old calves. Certainly, we know what all the positives are to the dairyman. Certainly favors limitations on time, inputs, and space requirements as far as space in an actual barn or building. Some of the potential cons, depending on the markets, there is potential for lost revenue. But compared to some of our other marketing options, whether we retain ownership and feed those calves or market those weaned calves, as Jerad alluded to. Calf health, if it's good, tends not to be much of an issue. But if calf health is consistently poor when we're selling those deacon calves or week-old calves, it's awful tough to establish a positive reputation with a buyer. And kind of the same with calf quality. Our goal should not to be to produce kind of that quote unquote black Holstein. So I'm really going to encourage the dairyman listening in to kind of think like a beef producer. We've intentionally bred that cow to a beef sire. So what can we do to that calf to possibly add some value? We look at producing and marketing weaned calves, weaning those calves and putting them in a group. We're going to show some dollars and cents evidence, the value of castrating those little calves, dehorning, vaccinating. There's a link there. There's several vaccination programs available. Do what fits not only your operation, but the calf buyers, right? Keeping those calves healthy as we transition from the dairy to the cattle feeder is important. When should we market our calves if we go down this route? A couple of things we need to consider is the cost of pound of gain, and then what is the carry value of those additional pounds? And often that's going to depend on the price of feed. I've got this morning's corn prices on the screen here, corn futures prices. And we can see that 750 corn for May certainly going to have an impact on what we do with some heavyweight calves here in the up close. And I've got that on the next slide. But do we market those weaned calves? Do we shoot for kind of that grower stage calf at 350 to 400 pounds? Do we maintain ownership of those calves, market them at 650s to 750s, or do we go ahead and feed those cattle out? Some research from Kenny Burdine at the University of Kentucky. And if you get our Ohio beef letter, we certainly use a lot of Kenny's information in there. Shown that corn price has the greatest impact on Holstein calf prices when those calves are lighter weights, from 300 to 400 pounds versus 400 to 500 pounds. And what that study showed is that one positive or increase of a standard deviation in corn price had a negative correlation to Holstein calf prices, ranging from $12 to $14 a hundredweight. And we can look here in recent times in the last few weeks and really see what corn price has done to some of our heavyweight cattle. So utilizing the futures as a tool, utilizing market reports can really give us an insight as to what is the best time to market our cattle from a profitability potential standpoint. If we're going to produce these beef on dairies, stocker or feeder calves, and both of our previous speakers talked about frame size, carcass weight, carcass length, and like Jerad said, we can utilize a high energy diet to limit some of that frame growth. However, as we consider marketing these stocker type calves, any growth that we put on these calves should be lean gain. We see pretty significant discounts for over conditioned, or sometimes you'll see it in a USDA market report as fleshy type feeder cattle. And inherently, when we're using beef genetics, we expect these calves, if our goal is to produce a high quality calf and carcass, to be a little bit thicker than our straight Holstein counterparts in terms of muscle thickness scores. What about adding value to these cattle? I think there's certainly potential, and we need to be intentional about it. Agent source verified programs. As a dairy, we know when every calf is born, and we do a very good job already of utilizing permanent identification, whether that's RFID or some sort of tagging system, and that's already in place. So let's go ahead and continue that with our beef on dairy calves and add some value. The non-hormone treated calves, certainly we see some demand for these type of cattle here in Ohio from some of our smaller feeders. And I'm going to show you a couple examples. There's demand for these type of cattle across the country. Now keep in mind that lot size and the number of calves we can get in a given lot are going to impact maybe the our rate of return on any value-added product. And that's all going to come down to the number of cows. Told you we'd show you some dollars and cents here, some cattle facts data as to the value of vaccination programs. We can see here that feeder cattle or stocker calves with zero to minimal vaccination do receive a discount somewhere to the tune of $5 to $9 a hundredweight. This was back in 2018. And then the premium programs, it really varies on which program you've utilized, the number of those premium value-added cattle available, and of course the demand for those cattle at the feed yard. Here in Ohio, I spend a lot of time working with cow-calf and stocker backgrounder producers. The value of steers of bulls is something we talk about in just about every presentation. We can see here that steer calves are going to outsell bull calves every month of the year. So if we can get those bull calves castrated in a beef on dairy system, we can certainly add value if we're selling those weaned and started cattle. In native cattle, we've seen that price premium to the tune of somewhere on average of $11 a hundredweight for 550 pounds steer versus bull calves. Lot size, certainly going to depend on the number of cows we're milking and uniformity in terms of genetics. We know that our dairy populations are relatively uniform with regards to genetics, but what are we utilizing from a beef sire perspective, as Jerad talked about? Are we just using the low man on a totem pole approach where we've got a straw of semen in the tank, or are we intentionally selecting for improved performance and genetics in these crossbred cattle? You know, here in Ohio, our dairy producers already have a partial advantage to the lot size equation over our beef cow producers. We got an average beef herd size of 17 cows in the state. I don't know exactly what our average dairy herd is, but I know that it's significantly greater than 17 cows. Where the disadvantage here comes into is you might not have all 17 cows or a large percentage of the herd that calve in a short window. So how can we manage maybe smaller groups of calves throughout the year as a consideration? But even with smaller groups of calves, we know that groups of 5 to 10 calves through the auction market significantly outsell groups of 1 to 3, and even multiples significantly outsell singles. You know, a lot of times when we talk about beef production, we talk about this magic number being a semi-load of 48,000 pounds. But maybe you work with a calf buyer or a local auction market or somewhere, even with small groups of cattle, where they can commingle and put together those semi-lot loads and add value. You know, I was kind of intrigued. I hadn't looked at some of the prices of these crossbred dairy beef calves here recently, and Chip really piqued my interest last week. Now I'm going to give you a disclaimer that these are large loads in terms of numbers ahead, and they've really had the kitchen sink thrown at them. They've been vaccinated, they're agent source verified, they're non-hormone treated cattle. You can see there, some of them are limb flex or Angus sired. But I was really impressed by the value of some of these Western dairy beef cross calves and the value that they have brought. You can see the prices there, $1.62 a hundredweight for $1.89 versus some of their Holstein counterparts that were listed for sale the same week at $1.25 versus $1.17. Similar weights, you know, load lots of cattle. That was pretty intriguing. I thought, you know, to see a $40 to $60 hundredweight premium for started beef on dairy cross calves. Once again, you know, it all comes back to how can we manage those cattle in terms of adding value, and what is it going to cost to keep those cattle for the additional period of time and add that 150, 200 pounds post weaning in this case. As we think about hide color, Jerad talked about the certified Angus beef and the potential for these crossbred dairy calves to enter that marketplace. You know, I'm looking forward to see what this slide looks like in the 2021 quality audit. You know, as we utilize more beef on dairy genetics, we saw last week the increase in beef semen sales, presumably to dairy producers. You know, what percentage of those cattle are going to be black in the 2021 audit, black hided, versus those calves that are native Holsteins going into the packing plants. So we think about retaining ownership, producing those fed cattle. You know, I certainly encourage you to review sessions 1 and 2 of this series. I see we got quite a few more people on here this afternoon, and then we've had the last 2 weeks. So we'll be sure that once we get the links to all the YouTube videos to send that out to our attendee list for the program. But another theme that we've heard the last 2 weeks is, you know, what about implanting these cattle? You know, how does that work versus non-implanted cattle versus our native colored cattle or straight Holsteins? You know, and in doing some research here the last couple of days, I'll tell you that the results are highly variable, but a consistent theme is that it is a cost-effective practice with a positive return on investment. That return on investment can vary. One white paper I've seen in the last few days suggested 10 to 15 to 1 return on investment. I've heard the drug companies that sell these products, talk about an 11, 12 to 1 return on investment. In a white paper that I've seen here yesterday from out west, talks about that return on investment being above the cost of a bushel of corn. So it's certainly variable, but most of the research agrees that it is a cost-effective practice, even to the point where maybe one of the highest return practices we can do in the feedlot. Why do we utilize implants? To increase average daily gain to feed efficiency. And if we're concerned about dollars and cents, when we increase efficiency, hopefully we are able to reduce cost of production if a proper implant strategy is utilized. We talked the first week from the marketing side of the fed cattle, what do our implant strategies look like? Are we looking at one terminal implant at kind of that 700 to 800 pounds? Do we need to implant the highest performing 25 or 50% of these crossbred calves? I think it's a valid question. And the data suggests that, as we get to some of those 3 implant programs, whether that's a low dose or raw grow at those calves for health reasons, then a moderate strength implant. But once we get above 2, we do see some tenderness issues in terms of that final product, decreased tenderness, and some potential marbling concerns or quality grade concerns rather. We'll finish up with that. Common strategy, single dose, what we call a terminal implant, usually a long acting implant, that 700 to 800 pound range, or a 2-dose program where we use a medium or low potency implant in that grower phase, followed by that terminal implant in the feedlot, depending on what our days from harvest schedule is. And we need to keep in mind that hopefully, if we've been intentional about making genetic selections, we've got these calves on a high energy diet, we should already have increased performance via genetics versus our straight Holstein calves. And this is actually a question I get pretty frequently from our cattle feeders in the western part of Ohio. What implants are available? What kind of programs are out there? I really like this Iowa Beef Center bulletin, and as we develop that implant strategy, keeping in mind that the most important implant in terms of improving performance and reducing cost is that last implant used prior to marketing. Think about it in the feedlot phase. If we're feeding a high energy, high concentrate diet, certainly our intakes at the highest point during the production cycle, where can we get that biggest return for the dollar from a practice? As we kind of wrap up here today, going through things relatively quick for the sake of time, what are the effective implants on quality grade in Holsteins? Looking here the other day, even though mean marbling scores were similar in a study from Apple in 1991 among treatment groups, only 50% of the estrogenic implant carcasses graded low choice or higher, compared to 100% of the control, no implants. And you can see the list there, whether it's trenbolone acetate, Zeranol, or estrogenic implants or combination. And then another study from Scheffler in 2003, where they had no select carcasses from the non-implanted cattle. And this is where they did a study with 1 dose, 2 dose versus 3, and the percentage of select carcasses from the implant cattle ranging anywhere from 10 to 18%. So just some things to keep in mind as we consider how to manage these calves. You know, are we leaving money on the table by selling these week-old or deacon type calves? Are there ways we can manage them similar to our native beef cattle and capitalize on that return on investment? So with that, we'll kind of wrap up here today. You know, I think as Jerad and I go forward, you know, here in our extension careers, I don't think this is a topic that's going to go away anytime soon. Probably spend a little more time focusing on the contribution to the beef industry from our dairy producers.